we've got to keep in mind that most of us have a future generation, whether they're our own kids and grandkids or whether they're our friends' grandkids, we're responsible for. And today, there's nothing more sacred than leaving behind an earth that's at least as good as we found it, if not better.
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Stanley Wu, and I'm the coordinator of Omega and the Resilience Project. Omega is the Resilience Funders Network, a collaborative working on the global polycrisis. Today we're joined by Ashok Khosla, who has over 6 decades in academia, government, international agencies, business, and civil society, and is a pioneering leader in the modern environmental movement. Hosted by Michael Lerner, we're looking forward to a conversation around Frugal innovations for speeding up and scaling out a sustainable future for all. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, the Cran's Foresight Analysis Nexus, and the New School at Commonweal. Now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Joan Diamond.
Well, good morning, good evening. Introducing Dr. Ashok Khosla is a little bit like trying to capture a prism, a lot of a shifting light and insight. There is the tangible, the prism itself. Born in Lahore in what is now Pakistan, his family moved to Delhi after partition in 1947. After a master's in natural sciences from Cambridge, he earned a PhD in experimental physics at Harvard with a dissertation, and I just can't resist this, on hyperfine structure of hydrogen halide isotopes. It's so much fun. It was at Harvard that he began working with Roger Revelle and directed his career to applying science to issues of social importance and exploring the relationships between people, their resources, and the environment. It was also at this time that Ashok first crossed paths with Michael Lerner. After completing his doctorate, Ashok was invited by the government of India to establish the Office of Environmental Planning and Coordination, the first environmental agency in what was then called the Third World. His list of accomplishments and awards and affiliations could take our entire session today. UN, Club of Rome, board member of financial institutions, leader in national and international policy, member of Academy of Sciences, every major international environmental award, and the voice of and for the poor. In 1983, Dr. Khosla set up Development Alternatives as a way to focus civil society and industry on eradicating poverty and making good business out of delivering sound development. This was the beginning of the social enterprise movement. Perhaps one of the best ways to summarize Dr. Khosla came in a response to the announcement of the webinar. Thomas Homer Dixon, an earlier speaker in this Omega Collaborative series, wrote, "Khosla is brilliant. I worked with him 30 years ago." In the world of those who have dedicated their lives to the social, environmental, economic issues of our time, the human predicament, the polycrisis, the chances are that at some point, Ashok Khosla has inspired, informed, and transformed their lives and career. Dr. Khosla brings energy, deep knowledge, genuine intelligence, innovation, and most importantly, compassion. In short, he brings wisdom and with it hope. Welcome, Ashok, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Sorry. Go ahead, Mike.
Forgive me, Ashok. I'll just take a moment to add to Joan's welcome. Ashok, as Joan mentioned, we've known each other for almost 60 years. And to me personally, in our work on the global polycrisis, this conversation with you is one of the most important we've had because you bring to it a range of experiences, and from the start of your work, you have sought to be hopeful about the future. From the time you worked with Roger Revelle and one of your students was Al Gore. Your course at Harvard took a hopeful perspective, while our colleague Paul Ehrlich took a much more skeptical perspective. So now here we are 60 years later, and a deep question for me is whether you are still able to hold that hope in some real way. What has happened to the world and to your thinking over that period of time? And because hope is such a critical dimension of human response to the polycrisis, that will be, I think, one of our themes as we hear you and have the conversation that follows. So with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Listen, it's such a great pleasure and privilege to be able to join you here. You and I do go back almost 60 years. I remember many great conversations we had at Harvard, and we were fortunate to be in the same dormitory, the same house, and where we could share meals together, and that gave us a great opportunity to get to know each other. And then, of course, we drifted apart, and we wove between each other's lives. We met at Rio, for example, for the Earth Summit, which was a terrific occasion when we could see and measure each other's progress in the search for, a better future. We met in San Francisco and in your place many times, and not enough times, just a few times, but it has always been a great source of inspiration for me. That what you've done and what you've achieved has been there. And Joan, who just started the meeting, and her late husband, Kirk, were really my dearest friends. They used to come to India every year, and we used to make sure that we met. And there was always something brand new that Kirk was thinking of, and it was always not only just enlightening to see a totally new angle on the problems of cooking, on the problems of energy, and the problems of the policies relating to air pollution and the indoor environment. Just a pioneer in so many fields. And then when he went back last year, he took to sending me wide varieties of news from his works and his friends' works, and it was terrific. And all of a sudden, he died, and I'm very, very saddened. And Joan, you really do have my heartfelt condolences. I thought I would like to share with you a few ideas. First, I thought I would talk about the role of the professional. I was going to give a talk on something that I haven't talked about with others in public much, but something that's been concerning me a great deal. We're in this mess because there's a class of people in whom society invested hugely in money, in education, in terms of privileges, and in many, many ways, with the expectation that the professional would be able to return some of that investment in the form of a better future for everyone. And that didn't happen. The world has been pretty badly, how would you say, convoluted by the fact that they were let down by people who really should have blown the whistle, should have designed things better, and so on. But then I thought maybe we should talk about something else that's more immediate and of topical relevance, and that's the post-COVID sort of recovery and how we might make use of this traumatic, this catatonic experience that we've had over a whole year, and use that to improve. And I thought I would try and include some of the thoughts coming out of that. But ultimately, right now, more and more people are concerned about things to do with both biodiversity and climate change. So I thought I'd meld all these things together and give you some thoughts So they're rather intermingled, and you'll have to bear with me if it's a little confusing, because they come from all kinds of different walks of life. But there's a common thread in them. And that common thread is that if we don't shape up very, very quickly, we are going to be in trouble. I am an optimist, but they say that an optimist is a pessimist who doesn't know everything. And I'm not sure that I want to be included in that category, but I basically can't imagine living a life where one is moping around and worrying about tragic consequences when one can do something about them. So all these ideas about the reflective practitioner, the issue of post-COVID recovery, and the issues of climate change and biodiversity are sort of woven through the next 30 minutes. So I hope you'll bear with me, because I'll be going pretty fast, and I'd like to share some of these ideas with you because I think they are going to continue to be important. Look, the world is finite and it's very sick. It's got problems which are life-threatening at the level of not just humanity, of life, of civilization, of life itself. I'm sure the planet will be around, but there will be a great diminishing of the values that it has right now. And some of these things are all visible. They're extreme poverty and deprivation. There's a fair amount of population growth still, but in some countries there's a population decline. There are issues of pollution and climate change and biodiversity, resource depletion and scarcity, social breakdown of violence and alienation, and leading to all kinds of problems like terrorism. And even breakdowns of finance. Every 8 years or so, we have a total collapse of our financial systems. So, you know, there are all these and other issues threatening life on Earth itself. And not being a total pessimist, I realized a long time ago that we've got to now take these as happening, but not as given, as things that we can do something about. And this is a very precious diagram for me. It comes from the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And it says, you know, there are 3 or 4 big things: human well-being. This is the 80-20 dilemma of 80% of the world being able to having to live on 20% of its resources and income. There's the climate issue, or how well we are handling the changes and crises of climate, and the ecosystems issues. But the arrow at the bottom is the one that's the most frightening, because, you know, none of these issues were around a few years ago. 20, 30 years ago, nobody even knew about them, and now they're headline material. And what worries us is that the surprise dilemma. We don't know what next year is going to bring. The pandemic brought it in 2020 in a manner that we will never forget. And so this is an example, the 2020 is an example of the surprise that we've got to deal with. We've had 20 years of, you know, great technology innovation and so-called human development. We've lived lives, some of the poorer parts of the world live lives which are probably better than the pharaohs used to live in many ways. And we have access to goods and services and various forms of knowledge and fulfillment that no one could have ever imagined before. The idea of more and more has basically run away with itself, and we are suffering from a sort of a disease called, which we call affluenza. And here's an example. I mean, this is a photograph taken by Peter Menzel. I'm sorry, it's gone here. Oops. A photograph taken by Peter Menzel a long time ago. They were talking about 1995, I think, of a family in the US who were persuaded to bring all their belongings out onto the street. And this is how, you know, they were living. This is in the mid-90s. This is a family in Germany, and they have, you know, a fair amount of food. This is 1 week's worth of food, and this is in 2005, and you know, you can see Unfortunately, my screen is a bit covered. So yes, you can see that they are pretty well fed. In fact, they waste so much of this food that it's essentially a reason why they're still alive, because otherwise they would be very sick if they ate all that. The situation that we're in, humanity sees itself as essentially dominant species, masters of the universe. And we have grown exponentially on almost every front. This is a diagram from Will Steffen. And you can see that the population, the communications, the travel, everything has been growing exponentially. And paper consumption, communications, telephones, and so on. So the overconsumers of this world are more or less concentrated in these kinds of areas. North America, Europe, Japan, Australia constitute what you might call overconsumption nodes. And it's a consumption society which lives pretty well and has been able to end up with the kind of chaos that only a very senseless society can do. Extracting huge amounts of resources out of nature, putting them into practice in chaotic terms, and ending up in the city dump. And this is an approach that has a lock-in built into it for decades, even centuries. Once you invest these kinds of monies in your roads, in your networks, in your transport systems, and so on, you're locked in. You have no way of breaking out of them. And this has required us to mine the earth, poison the environment and the countryside, and it's led to the crisis of climate, forest fires. In the in domain of disasters, so-called natural disasters, or in the case of financial systems, and so on. And this kind of growth, of economic growth, has basically got an inexorable need for more and more resources. This is a graph of the resources that we call it the metabolic rate, the amount of resources used per capita per year, growing all the way up from the very poorest countries on the bottom left to some of the more consuming countries in the north. Now, if you're above that red line, you are consuming more than you are entitled to, well, I mean, compared with the others. And if you're below it, then you're a bit more efficient. And here you have a plot of the amount of metals that countries use. And this is a three-dimensional plot. So the metals are on the x-axis down at the bottom here, where my cursor doesn't seem to show. The amounts are on the y-axis, and the z-axis over here, which basically shows different countries. And you can see the huge difference between the metal use in the poorer countries for those in the rich. And this is an indicator of a very different kind of development. And we have not just peaked in fossil fuels, but in food production, in topsoil, in phosphorus, in fisheries. 60% of the fisheries of the world, according to the FAO, are in a state of collapse. Water supplies, in California, you know that probably better than most people. Uranium, rare earths, and so on. And today, droughts worldwide affect more than 500 million people. I mean, it's very dry land in 15%, was 15% in 1970, and very dry land had become about 30% 30 years later. This is a photograph of a place that I work in central India. It used to be a lush teak and bamboo forest 70 years ago. Today it's gone. And UNEP says that the world is increasing its deserts by something of the order of 50,000 square kilometers per year. Extinction of species, well, what can one say? This is a rosy periwinkle from Madagascar. And it's one of the sole sources of cure for childhood leukemia. It it's about to disappear, and once it does, there isn't really any other source at the moment available. Tigers gone, resources, sand, sand of all things. It's become so scarce that in many countries it's not available. Sand is not available in Dubai. Sand is not available in Singapore. They used to import it, and now they can't even import it anymore. They're manufacturing it by crushing stone. In India, sand mafias are earning huge amounts of money because it's gone. One of the most common resources. And this all leads to our ecological footprint, which of course everybody on this webinar would fully know about. And we have, in fact, among the participants, our friend Mathis Wakernagel, who's the sort of originator of the concept. And I'm delighted that you joined us, Mathis. This is an old diagram, and I apologize to Mathis for using it because I haven't updated my slide. But basically, you can see that right now, we're close to around using the production, the resources produced by 2 worlds rather than 1. And this is going to get worse and worse. This is a very famous diagram. It comes from a book that was published in 1972 called The Limits to Growth by the Club of Rome. And I happen to have been associated a great deal with the Club of Rome, so I'd like to show this. And this red dotted dashed line in the middle is 2020. And you can see that actually the Club of Rome team, MIT researchers, were probably on the optimistic side. We're doing worse. We'll be tracking a worse curve on almost every front than they had basically foreseen. Now, the world's distribution of income and wealth in 1991 looked like this. We call it the champagne glass theory of development. This was reported, this was on the cover actually of the first UN Human Development Report in 1991. The richest fifth of the population of the world was essentially hijacking around 85% of its income. That's the influenza part. And the rest of the world, about 60, 70% of it was just getting around 10 or 12%. Not much of a distribution. But now we don't talk about 2080. Only 20 years later, we were talking about 1%. And now we even talk about 0.1%. It's from a champagne glass, we've gone to a bar stool. I mean, it's just incredible at what speed the whole economy of the world has turned upside down, and the injustices, the lack of equity, and the lack of fairness has just completely evaporated. And now you've got overconsumption and underconsumption in stark contrast. And you've got these kinds of societies living cheek by jowl. Obviously, at some point, things are going to give way. This is where the underconsumers live. This is a woman in the same area that I showed you, that desert, very close to that. I like to show this picture because, for me, she is not just a symbol, but she's representative of about more than a third, maybe 2/5 of the world. This woman, all her belongings are in that picture. In fact, I would say her whole world is in that picture. And what is worse is that whenever I look at it, I wonder whether one of these girls here, her daughters, could have been a Marie Curie. She could have been a Maria Callas. But there is no chance that she will ever have to be outstanding, let alone be fulfilled. And this is really the life that made me personally unable to continue to do my work on hyperfine structures of halide molecules. These are people who every day have to walk miles for 3-4 hours bringing water home. There are 300, maybe more, today probably more, like double that, people who don't have adequate drinking water. They have to walk miles for their fiber, their food, their fuel. And as distinct from that German family I showed you, here is a Yadav family also taken by Peter Menzel, also in the same year, 1995-94. And this is their entire belongings. They brought everything out of their house and put it out here, and are showing how they live. I got this picture taken, again, near that woman's hut. This is a whole family called the Prajapatis. They are potters by profession. And this is the entire food that they have available for 1 week. A total of about $4 or $5 worth. This was in 2015. And then, you know, I see this picture. I've hung this picture in front of the reception in our office, which, if you can see, my picture is behind me. In my office, every staff member has to see this picture every day to remind them that we have work to do. This is not a sign of pessimism. This is actually a sign of optimism, because we plan to deal with this. We plan to leave behind a world that doesn't have pictures like this. But this girl and her 2 little brothers, you can see one in her lap, are entitled to ask President Kennedy, what has my country done for me? And frankly, the answer is not pretty. And this is going to affect all of us. This is going to affect people in Bangladesh, in India, in Pakistan, in Fiji, in small island states, but it's going to affect people in California and in Iowa and in all over the world, because you are going to have people coming, running away from ecosystem destruction, sea level rise, so-called development projects, dams, roads, civil strife, hunger, and indeed from total economic breakdown. So the solutions are sustainable lives and livelihoods. My last 40 years has been spent in trying to bring together this Venn diagram from bringing together looking for solutions that come more or less in the middle there in the dark green, which bring together the needs of the planet, environmental quality, the needs of the people, social equity, and the needs of business, profits and work, because without business, it's just hard to see a future. This is why in 1982, I started what was the first social enterprise in the world, because I could not see how we could completely discard the marketplace for the solutions any more than we could discard faith-based organizations, people's organizations, right, or NGOs. And in order to improve the world for the future, we need to have equity, environment, and economy all together. Sustainable distribution of global income is not going to be like a champagne glass, much less a bar stool. It's going to be more like a beer glass, or I like to think a glass of water. We are going to have to find ways in which we have the ability to have every single person fulfill their lives in whatever way they want. And part of that is enshrined in the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The SDGs are wonderful. They have the almost unanimous commitment of 190 odd countries. But because of that, they're a bit of a lowest common denominator too. There are things in there that should have been in there, but couldn't be because there were countries that wouldn't accept them. So one has to recognize that these are wonderful goals, and we're going to try and achieve them. And then we must go beyond. We mustn't think that that's all that we need to do. The people dimension, the circle in the Venn diagram on the left, the planet dimension, the circle at the top, and the prosperity dimension on the side. This is a combination that we need to do, and we've got to do it in such a way that we decouple the improvement in human well-being from resource use and from environmental impact. And in order to do that, we need efficiency. We need to use our resources efficiently. But then, if you're not going to leave the poor behind, you've also got to keep in mind the idea of sufficiency. Sufficiency comes in 2 forms. One is the ceiling. You can't go beyond what you have if what you have is sufficient. And there is the floor. You must have at least an adequate amount, sufficiency as adequacy, to be able for every human being to lead a decent life. And these must match the market issues of desirability and acceptability, demand and supply. So in order to do that, we've got to start thinking about new kinds of tools. We need to improve resource productivity, mostly through innovation of technologies, resource reduction, use of resources, reducing them through substitution, for example, and conservation of resources through fundamental changes in behavior. Part of them are technological, part of them is substitution, but behavior change is like miniaturization. You know, the computer I used for my PhD at Harvard in the early 60s was bigger than a huge building. It needed a 3-story building to house it. Your cell phone today has more power than that. So miniaturization has been happening willy-nilly. But durability, product life extension, is something that you got to work for, because people like to discard things and find new things. But durability is a powerful mechanism. If you use a car for 10 years, you're obviously going to use half the resources than if you discard it after 5. And it's a huge difference in the amount of resources used. Sharing of underutilized assets, the sharing economy, Uber, Airbnb, etc., have already started happening. But where I'm going to concentrate the next few minutes that I have is on nature-based solutions, on biomimicry, on trying to do more with less of resources. And this leads us to the so-called circular economy, from what we have today, which is a linear economy of take, use, and throw away, to a circular economy in which we, by design, use resources over and over again. They fit into a perpetual flow through our economy. But a circular economy can be, bad too, because those 2.5–3 billion people who live in poverty, they're living a circular economy, but it's a vicious cycle. And that's a cycle of poverty to no markets, to destroying your resources even more, to no income, to more bigger families, to more poverty, etc. That's a vicious cycle that you got to get out of. And the answer is find ways to do that different. One way is to use your wastes, mining, urban mining. Another way is to go for industrial ecology, where the raw materials of one industry come from the wastes of another. There are many, many such possibilities, and they all really have to feed into a systems optimization on a life cycle kind of basis, using information technology, better management methods, and the aim has to be zero emissions. This applies to transport systems, it applies to urban design, it applies to different kinds of ways to do things. I'm personally a great champion of lighter than aircraft, because the analysis is incredible. If you take different forms of transport, for example, river transport or water transport, is pretty cheap. Now, these lines that I have, the vertical bars, are composed of 3 things. One is operational costs, that is the fuel costs, if you like. And second is the infrastructure costs, the roads and ports and everything else. And the third is the rucksacks, the ecological impacts. And if you look, the way it gradually gets up higher and higher from rail to road to air. But if you look at lighter than aircraft, it has really a huge potential for solutions for the world's transport problems. We've got to sell these ideas. The existing technologies were based on physics and chemistry. And they were hugely resource guzzling and waste regurgitating. The future technologies are going to have to be based on disruptive industries will have to be based on disruptive technologies by reducing and using wastes. And this is the headquarters of my own building. It's in South Delhi. It's a very nice building to work in. It nurtures creativity in ways that I'd never imagined. And it's so elegant that several embassies have requested to rent space in it over the years. It is made almost entirely out of natural materials, compressed earth, no fired bricks, compressed fly ash blocks, that means wastes from thermal power stations, demolition wastes, stone dust from mining quarries. The amount of virgin material in this building is about 30 to 35%. The rest is all reutilization of waste materials. Over the 40 years that my organization has been in existence, we've conducted huge numbers of innovations of various kinds of technologies, which we call frugal technologies, technologies that create totally new ways to do things. Over the last four millennia, 3 millennia if you like, there have been 4 types of cement: the Babylonian cement, the Roman cement, the pozzolanic cement, and the Portland cement. And my colleagues have invented the 5th one, low carbon cement, which is an amazing breakthrough, which was launched globally at the Marrakesh Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. It was financed by the Swiss government. It is now a major potential way of building with much lower carbon emission. This is another technology. Vertical shaft brick kiln reduces carbon emissions by 50% compared with the existing technologies. And many other technologies, check dams, small dams that have an amazing impact. Water filters, charcoal making, cook stoves, compressed earth. Obviously there's solar and wind. We've basically been working on solutions that make people's lives better and reduce the impact on Mother Earth. These are the kinds of, this is paper recycling, handmade paper recycling, creating jobs locally and making a big difference in the lives of people. Here is a very nice example. This is a weed. It's called Ipomia. In Hindi, it's called Besharam, which means shameless, because the more you cut it, the more it grows. In fact, in Pakistan, across the border, they call it politician for the same reason. And this basic weed, which is prolific, is now, had no use whatsoever. The government used to pay communities to cut it down for allowing the water to flow. We converted it into a fuel and gasified it in this bottom left-hand corner, and then put it into a diesel engine, and we sell electricity in a commercially competitive way. So these are the kinds of things we've been doing. We service partners, mainly households, housewives, irrigation pumps, local halwais, what do you call them, restaurants, water enterprises, tailoring units, and so on, schools. And we've been quite successful in creating local generating capacity under the control of the community. I'm going to have to speed up because I've got to finish this thing. I would like to just share with you a few ideas from biomimicry. Biomimicry is about bringing the 5 kingdoms of nature together to do what we would normally do with machines and with chemistry and so on. Here is a termite hill. It's an amazing device. The termites, to protect their queen, have to maintain the temperature in the middle. They're at 26.4 plus or minus 1 degree all through the year. And they do that through very intricate airflows. And this Swedish architect who made this building in the capital of Zimbabwe, Harare, used the termite principles. And this building is extremely valuable. It's the most valuable piece of real estate in Africa because it doesn't need air conditioning. It really saves a huge amount of energy. Zebras have stripes, and many people don't realize this, but these stripes are a natural air conditioning system from which many other air conditioning systems have been inspired. This is Professor Jorge Reynolds from Colombia, an old friend of mine, who invented the cardiac pacemaker, the heart pacemaker. He did that, he did subsequent improvements on it by studying the heart of a whale and converting the findings into amazing devices, which now actually can be used externally without having to do any operations. This is a lizard in the Sahara Desert, which can go at a phenomenal speed under the sand. And industries have now been set up, learning from how it does that, to make ball bearings and lubricants which are technically superior to almost anything else. This is a red seaweed. It has a way of producing antibiotic resistance by stopping the communication basically between bacteria. So it is an amazingly natural system for antibiotics, which has been commercialized. This is a beetle in the Namibian desert in southwest Africa. It pulls water out of the air, and in sufficient quantities that it can service its own needs as well as other creatures. It's an amazing, I'm sorry my cursor doesn't work, but if you look at it carefully, you will see little pock marks. Now, the valleys are hydrophilic. They attract water, and the mounds are hydrophobic. They repel water. And so the water accumulates like these drops below it, and they essentially coalesce, and you get a stream of water. Here is a little creature that has taught us how to transport vaccines without refrigeration. Bacteria that have taught us how to mine metals by bioaccumulation rather than by digging, and so on. We can work on buildings, we can work on automobiles, using principles and sometimes services provided by nature. All our water needs, all our health needs, a lot of our health needs, and our climate change. These are all amenable to nature-based solutions, many of them from the biomimicry end. So there are disruptive technologies like these and others based on knowledge. And what you and I have to remember is that these are systemic issues. We now need to bring basic needs of the 2 or 3 billion people who got left behind with the needs of protecting the environment for future generations. We have to set up production systems and consumption patterns that are viable and in consonance with the needs of future generations. And we have to create sustainable jobs and sustained resources. So ultimately, it's about the rich and the poor. We've got to now somehow figure out how, without having those who have lose much, but being able to bring the others up together with them. So Michael asked me whether I was an optimist or a pessimist. All I can say is that given the wonderful potential, how could one be a pessimist? There is no way that this girl is going to have the kind of life that the one that I showed earlier is going to have, because we're going to all make it happen and make a world that is both happy and prosperous for all. As Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change you want to see. But if you don't, you're going to create, and if we don't create a new culture, we're going to need a lot more planets. Thank you.
Ashok, thank you so much. Can you stop sharing your screen? There we go. Wonderful. Ashok, that was an extraordinary presentation. And there are so many directions we can take this. I'm also encouraging people who would like to post questions in the chat function, and we'll try to get to some of them. But let me start with this question. You mentioned one of the areas that you thought about talking about was more about COVID and recovery. And I wonder, what are your reflections on COVID?
Well, first of all of us know, I don't have to repeat, that COVID is the result of a total ecological breakdown. Right. So, we know that. I'm not going to go spend time on it. It's going to happen again more and more if we continue to drive the bats from their homes, to drive the animals away from their homes. If we're going to break down our wetlands and our ecosystems, we're going to have more and more problems, not only zoonotic diseases, but other breakdowns. And so the lesson that we've got to learn from COVID is that if we're going to prevent such things from happening in the future, because already, literally in the last 2 decades, we've had 8 or 10 of these, and we didn't notice. And COVID has brought it home in a stark manner, and we've got to do something about it. So the first lesson is we've got to take care of Mother Earth if we're going to have her take care of us. And COVID's given us a very stark example of that. And it's only people with very short memories who are going to forget it, or very, very strong vested interests. You do realize that there are far more billionaires today than there were a year ago. In India, there were 137 billionaires at this time last year, and there are 177 billionaires. That means 40 people became billionaires in the last during the lockdown, and each of them has accumulated vast amounts of wealth. And this happened in the US and everywhere else. So COVID has not taught them anything, but it's taught us that, this is not something that's viable. Now, the other part that COVID has taught us is probably what AOC and all the other people are talking about when they talk about a Green New Deal, that we've got to now take political action. We've got to find new ways of dealing with technology and new kinds of institutions. But above all, we've got to change our behavioral systems, behavioral behaviors, in order to avoid these things from happening. So if we don't act pretty soon and we forget what happened in the lockdowns for a year, then we've lost a huge chance. But it seems to me that we now have the ability to ask the relevant questions. And a lot of people, today, this is my 4th webinar. I started at 7:30 in the morning. It's now 10:30 at night. And the first one was with the United Nations Environment Program. Then there was another one with another group in Chicago and so on. So we're people are actually concerned. So I think to some extent, we've got to ride this thing on the wave in a way that we can't let people forget, and we've got to force them to change. The kinds of technologies I showed you were just the superficial changes, but they do enable us to see a future in which things can be better for everyone.
Your friend Mathis Waknagel has just posted a question. Thank you, Ashok. Fabulous. Given 60 years of experience in the field with all the hindsight, what are the most marvelous mistakes in trying to shift the human path you have learned from? And what would you now do differently? Warm best wishes.
Well, my best wish is that governments and business leaders think of that little girl that I showed at the end of my story, and put her at the top of their, Mahatma Gandhi. I hate to quote Einstein and Mahatma Gandhi because they're overquoted, but he had a little paragraph which he called the talisman, and he starts by saying, "Let me give you a talisman." And this talisman is now reprinted in every single textbook that is printed in India. It's in every Hindi and English and all language textbooks in the local language, with a picture of Gandhi saying, whenever you have to make a decision, think of the person who was most deprived and look at their face and ask, will my decision help them? And, this is basically the one wish, if I had to have a wish, that we, the voters, we, the public, we, the people who elected all these leaders and who paid for all these businessmen and women, we are going to have to force them to think different. So that's the easy way to answer your Mathis's question. The harder way is that we, the few people like us on the screen, the practitioners, realize that we've got a huge responsibility, and it's an intergenerational responsibility. It's not simply to take care of each other. It's leaving behind a world in which life can survive. And so that's a little general, but that's what I would like to see our leaders think about. And the progressives in your political system are thinking like that. There are very few of them, but there are a few people.
Our colleague Marianne Mott, who has contributed a lot to this work, asked the question, what are the barriers to advancing the solutions that are most ripe for being overcome? In other words,
well,
what are the barriers to dealing with the most ripe opportunities?
There are barriers in terms of vested interest, because people make money in the ways they know, and they're not going to switch very far from them. So there's one barrier is the vested interests of people, if you'll pardon the phrase, who have their snouts in the trough. This includes business, and it also includes a large part of our political leaderships in all the countries. Either for power or for money, they are basically going to stop from anything from changing. Then there are barriers which are cognitive. There are barriers which are inherent in the way human beings think, because we're used to the status quo and we find it very hard to question it and break out of patterns of thinking which have served us, in our opinion, well. This is where innovation and science and art and everything else comes in, and we've got to basically nurture the breakthroughs from the overcoming of barriers by such people. The other part is the barrier that it's a kind of an intergenerational one, that the barrier that the dominant generation, the generation of people who make decisions, don't necessarily respect the following generations and allow them to break out. So there are many other barriers, I'm sure, but these are the kinds that we face a lot.
So here's a question that I sit with a lot, Ashok. Since we started the Omega Resilience Funders Network and the Omega Collaborative, we are looking around the world for thought leaders who really understand the global polycrisis and understand that, as you've demonstrated, there are several dozen global vectors interacting with increasing speed, producing completely unpredictable outcomes with increasing force and increasing frequency. And so, as you said, it's not just climate change, it's all these different things. And yet, when you ask where are the centers of thought and the centers of potential action that really take the whole global problematique into account, at least in my experience, there are thinkers who do that, but they're very hard to find. So my question to you is, from your extraordinary experience, over the last 6 decades, what places, what centers, where would you look for allies and thought partners who really understand the polycrisis as a whole, who are not only working in their silos, whether they be poverty or climate change or whatever, but are really addressing the real issue, which is the polycrisis as a whole? Where do you look for those?
Thank you. Michael, let me just connect this with the previous Marilyn Mott's question about barriers. I didn't on purpose mention the underlying barrier. I wouldn't say the biggest barrier, but it's a big barrier, which is lack of funding for doing the right stuff, lack of support, because people either don't understand it or they find it threatening to support finding solutions that don't necessarily fit their viewpoint. So the answer to your second question is, again, lack of support for dealing with the root causes. You know, the polycrisis is a crisis of species extinction, of climate change, of poverty, extreme poverty, of hazardous this and that, and everything together. But because the root causes are pretty well the same for all of them. They're all the manifestations of issues that stem basically from poorly designed consumption patterns, production systems, and greed. You know, and in fact, you go back one step, and you really basically what I was talking about at 7:30 this morning are living in an economy that is called a neoliberal economy, which is based on a so-called science, an economic science called neoclassical economics. And neoliberal economies and neoclassical economics is based on greed. I mean, it's outright. It claims to be on the nurturing and worshipping of greed. So the issue is there are fundamental changes to be made. Now, if you're going to have people thinking about climate change alone, and I have this problem with some of my most eminent scientific friends around the world. They are thinking about their narrow area, and then they say, this is the important issue. And they're actually working against themselves, because if they got allies across the board, they would have a much better potential for finding, support and solutions. I think there are two kinds of organizations that have some chance of coming close to what you're saying. One, I think, is DA, my own organization, which was set up precisely for this reason. And every time people come and see us, or even our own colleagues, they say, wow, we've never seen anything that is so systemic, is dealing with such systemic issues in such a systemic way. And I think I can proudly say that we've had a fairly solid impact, because on a daily basis, we're not in departments or in divisions, we're in branches which work together and try to grow solutions that would have what are called today co-benefits. When we talk to people about climate change and adaptation and mitigation, they probably say, well, there's a co-benefit. Yeah, there's a co-benefit, but why not lots of co-benefits that you can get because you change the fundamental premises on which your economy is dependent. Now, what are the other institutions? I think the World Resources Institute comes close. I think the institutions the non-institutions, the kinds of gatherings of people who have day jobs but come and work together on these things, like the Club of Rome, are institutions of that type. I was very privileged to be the president of the Club of Rome for 8 or 9 years, and I have to say that it was a wonderful experience, because I had access to virtually all the different kinds of how would you say, sectoral knowledge, but from people who were actually looking at it in intersectoral or transsectoral ways. So this was something very powerful. I would also say that there are attempts, for example, at Oxford University, there is a center for, it's called the Smith Institute. I've forgotten his name, which is looking at the future, and you're being sponsored by an organization that has foresight in its name. What was that organization called?
Foresight Analysis Nexus.
Foresight Analysis. Now, that is basically the fundamental issue. Do we have any foresight? We now need to look at how incredibly well endowed we were in many ways by our ancestors. We inherited, cultures and languages and science and infrastructures and everything else from them. We also inherited some lousy bad things from them. But we have to ask, what kind of ancestors are we going to be for the future generations? So the issue is, do we have institutions? The question that you're asking, I would translate, do we have institutions that are asking, how can we be better ancestors? And, apart from a few, and I happen to be on the board of some of them, because naturally we gravitate towards each other, the World Resources Institute, Development Alternatives, the Institute of Environment and Development, the International Institute of Sustainable Development in Winnipeg. These are the kinds of institutions. There are a dozen or so, 1 or 2 in Japan, 1 or 2, not many in India and in the South, but in Europe, in Germany, I would say maybe the Wuppertal Institute, maybe the Potsdam Institute, but they are funded for being climate change or energy or food. They're not, unlike DA, Development Alternatives, which seeks support for the poly crisis set of solutions to poly crises. They are seeing the Potsdam Institute as a climate institute. It has very wise people. It has people who would be, who are in the Club of Rome and so on. But inside the institutions, the halls that you walk through are either biodiversity or climate change or so-called water systems or development. And I think they lose a lot because of that. Now, there's one institute in Austria, near Vienna, in Luxembourg, called the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, which has a distinguished history of systems analysis. And it willy-nilly is one of those. But it's probably, the development alternatives, IASA, I think these are the 3 or 4 that really would be close to what you're saying.
I'd like to invite Joan Diamond to rejoin us for this last segment and hear the questions that she has as well. Carlos Schultz, a colleague from Brazil, I will just summarize his question. Could scholarships like the 21st century version of the Rhodes Scholarship or seeding local global knowledge-based organizations be of special benefit? In other words, considering, he says, knowledge might be our most valuable resource, how do you see the best way to distribute it among experts, managers, leaders who will create and distribute it to everyone?
Look, obviously what he's saying is absolutely correct. I mean, how can I deny that? You and I and almost everybody on this webinar went to good colleges, good schools, good colleges, good universities, good graduate schools. And we learned a great deal. But I look back on my life, and it was the people I worked with that made me do what I do. It was John Kendrew, who got a Nobel Prize for deciphering the myoglobin molecule at Cambridge, who was my personal friend and tutor and mentor, who made me feel that science was something special. It was Norman Ramsey, who was probably the only Nobel Prize winner in history, who got the Physics Nobel Prize in 1989 and shared it with every one of his graduate students. I got $1,000 of the 1989 Nobel Prize. There were people like Roger Rebel, who was my friend and colleague and mentor for 30 years. And we learned a lot from each other, but mainly I learned from him. We started with climate change and environment, and we had, as you said, we not only had Al Gore, but we had people like Benazir Bhutto, who became Prime Minister of Pakistan, a lot of other people. That was a very famous course, who fed into our later lives, great things. So, scholarship is a terrific way. I have no problem with that. And a good scholarship gives a person a great head start, and I think it's important. But I think the real issue is, how do you mix people who are creative and thinking with people who want to be creative and thinking, and bring them together on a sustained basis, apprenticeship, if you like. I mean, I feel like I was an apprentice to all these people. Perhaps the greatest influence in my life was, in fact, my father, believe it or not. He was an eminent, a professor and diplomat, but it was he who really helped me create development alternatives. I went in one day from a job with $150,000 a tax-free salary to a job with $2,000 a year salary. And he was so proud of that. I mean, for him, this made his whole life worthwhile. Because it's not just knowledge, but it's commitment. It's also what the knowledge is for. So I was terribly privileged, and what your friend from Carlos from Brazil says is absolutely correct, but it's not enough. What we need is people to work with a Kirk Smith and really, imbibe what it is to be inquisitive, to be curious, to be like a tiger, going to the root of the truth in this thing. And so, yeah, let's get the money and let's do the scholarships, but let's find people who are willing to work with each other as well.
Joan, you've been listening and have been with your late husband, Kurt, one of Ashok's close friends. What comes to your mind as questions to ask Ashok?
Well, of course, as always, there are many. I guess two questions, but one really is, are there things that I'll say we can do, or is industry moving fast enough on this path? And are there things that we in this audience, in our networks, can do to engage industry and really move it from the sort of NGO civil society realm into how we operate as a global enterprise?
Well, that was the purpose of this social enterprise that I was talking about, to not just do good by doing well, but to do good by doing good, right. And to do well by doing good. And so essentially, my thesis is that every business in the future will be more and more driven by the public, by the consumer, hopefully by the forces of the market, to avoid doing the very bad things and do more good things. But to do good things is not enough. You've got to actually make good a product of your enterprise. And so making something just because there's a demand for it, or there's a market for it, or it makes money, is not quite enough. It should also be improving the lives of people, improving nature, improving the chances of a long-term future. I really do want to tell you that I've got a wonderful organization, and as you can see behind me, it's a heavy-duty organization, which we built painstakingly over 35, nearly 40 years, 1 year less, and it's dying. At the moment, we are at the moment so strapped, partly because of the drying up of funds pre-COVID, and during COVID it was worse. And it is true of a very large amount of civil society generally. Most of us are actually now so squeezed, we cannot do creative work. It is very difficult because we're surviving from day to day. And part of that reason is that we are living in a time when democracy has almost evaporated. If you look at the countries today, the big countries that have suffered from increasing autocratic systems, which includes the US, by the way, it includes Brazil, it includes virtually, most of Latin America, it includes Hungary and Poland, and it includes a good part of Europe going more and more right. It includes Egypt, it includes Turkey, it includes Philippines, it includes India. The point is that we are now in a squeeze. Civil society is in a squeeze, won by autocratic governments who hate criticism, who cannot stand independent thinking, they do not like to be questioned, and so they are throttling us. And on the other hand, corporates who don't actually want to be called for what they're doing and be criticized. In India, they introduced about 10, 12 years ago a law for what is called corporate social responsibility by law. They introduced a 2% tax on essentially a tax on every business on their 2% of their profits to go to civil society. Now, all that money is going to the Prime Minister's fund for COVID. Civil society is getting nothing. So essentially, whether it's money coming from business as philanthropy, whether it's money coming from government as support to civil society, whether it's coming from aid money from overseas, it's all gone, it's finished. We used to have a turnover of $15–20 million, and now we're a skeleton. We're 1/10 that. We have to run around trying to make a living. So there is a real problem today all over the world. This is not just a DA problem. It's a problem all over the world. I'm not here to complain. I just wanted to tell you that with people like Jeff Bezos, who's just set up a $10 billion fund, with his ex-wife, who's apparently doing amazing stuff, with other people, Jeff, Skoll and others, the new money as well as the old money is there, but it's only people like you who can influence them to spend it in a way that actually nurtures the kind of stuff that we need. They're not listening to us. They used to. We were supported by the Swiss government, by the British government, by the US, by the Canadian government, huge amounts of money. We raised more than $300 million over the last 30 years. But at the moment, it's all evaporated. And it's partly now, because of COVID, almost invisible. And yet, we are the only ones who are actually going to be able to help solve the problems.
Well, I just want to say that is a very, very sad, one could say tragic situation. And I know that some of us on this call, alerted to this situation, will be thinking hard about opportunities in this area, both for you and also simply your analysis of what's happening. But I have to say, Ashok, that what you've done with development alternatives, I like to think of Commonweal as a think and do tank. And I would say that development alternatives is one of the greatest think and do tanks in the world.
Thank you.
So surely some of your friends and colleagues and those who don't know you until now will be thinking hard about this. Joan, what other questions or reflections come to mind?
I would just like to add one thing to what you said, Michael, which is that I would encourage everyone on this call and to share with their friends a visit to the Development Alternatives website, because Ashok's description, moving through the slides quickly, of what goes on there doesn't do justice to the innovation and the depth of their work. So I just encourage that.
Thank you. I'm sad to say that our website has not been updated for a while because we're so busy trying to stay alive. But if you forgive that, it does have a lot of stuff in it. Yes.
Yeah. No, it gives a good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and now I feel a little bit uneasy asking this question, but I will. And that's if you could comment or insights on the growing poverty in the advanced economies, the growing percentage of the populations, and the degree to which that is a threat to the issues that we are concerned about, or is that just the wrong lens to use?
No, that's a terrific lens to use. It's number one, it's an indicator of the malaise, the systemic rot, if you like. It's more than a malaise. It's a systemic, basic breakdown of economies where the average per capita income is 8 or 10 times the income of a good portion of its people. It doesn't make any sense, of course, from the point of view of the poor, but it doesn't actually make any sense from the point of view of the rich either, because they have far less access to good skilled labor. They have far less access to the kinds of productivity that they're entitled to have from their industries and so on. So it's very short-sighted, and it's a total misreading of Adam Smith. I mean, it's not basically what the classical economists were talking about. The issue right now is that the people who populate the economics departments of Harvard, MIT, Yale, Princeton, and so on, just don't seem to understand that the distributive aspects of an economy are even more important than the aggregate aspects of the economy. And so, everybody, when you talk to an economist, they say, well, what difference does it make? It'll trickle through, or it goes into the society. That is not so. for one thing, every human being is a human being. They're not a percentage. They're not a number. They are a valuable act of creation, and they have a right to have a decent life. But apart from that, it is so counterproductive to have a country like America have so much incredible destitution that people can't even, feed their children. They can't even get medical attention. So what can I say? I mean, it makes me, I lived in the US for 10 years. I consider myself a kind of a, US citizen, as much as I'm an Indian citizen. But frankly, it's distressing to see how little caring there is in a society that used to be extremely caring. I mean, America's built on philanthropy, on charity, on giving. This is a country that has cultivated the art of mutual support and taking care of each other. And it's all gone. I don't understand where it went, how it went. But when you elect the kind of people that you have been electing in the recent past, you obviously made a decision that only money counts. I mean, I don't know what else one can say. And only large amounts of money counts. So the answer, Joan, is, on my part, extreme distress and unhappiness to see a country that could be the greatest place in the world to live in for, I don't know, 1/3 of its population, maybe more, is a living hell. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. When I was growing up in Massachusetts in the middle 60s, I used to sell encyclopedias door to door. And I used to sell them all over New England. I used to go out in a car with a team, drop them off, and I used to go to Vermont and New Hampshire, Maine, and this. And you won't believe it, but even in Manchester, New Hampshire, let alone Newport, Vermont, I used to run into numerous people who couldn't read. They were functionally illiterate. Not numerous, not in the sense they were in the tens of percent, but there were enough. And yet they were living full, decent lives. They had decent jobs. They were, well-fed. They had, in the 60s, frankly, whether you had skills or not, you had education or not, you had a decent life. I mean, you didn't have the kind of homelessness that you have today. So I find it extremely painful because for me, America is my country. And I just don't know how it got to be that in that sick a shape. But it's the same in my country here in India. And we've not taken care of each other. If you were to divide the total GDP of the country among everybody equally, obviously it wouldn't work. That's not what we're talking about. But you can choose patterns of development, policies, technologies, and a lot of other things that basically take care of all, at least to a minimum level of decency. And those little girls that I was showing you pictures of wouldn't be there.
Ashok, let me ask you a more internal question as we come toward the end here. You've done this profoundly extraordinary work over the last 6 decades. Can you describe what internal guide star, whether it be a philosophical or spiritual orientation that sustains you through the hard times and that guides you? Is there either a person or a philosophical or spiritual system or something else that really is what enables you to sustain yourself in this often very difficult work?
Thank you, Michael. You're asking a profound question to which I have a very shallow answer, unfortunately. It's in the DNA. I never really, I have no philosophies. I have no faiths. I have no, I don't believe in supernatural. I don't have any, I don't actually have any external or internal driving force. I just live from day to day. And the only thing that keeps me going is the excitement of finding a problem to solve and solving it if I can. Really, it's that bad. I mean, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I don't have what normal people have, which is, an extreme commitment to a deity or to a religion or to a philosophy. I'm totally illiterate. I'm totally illiterate. I mean, I don't know any of these things. I do recall that when I was at Cambridge, there were 4 years. I was in Cambridge for 4 years because I felt sick for a little while, and almost every couple of weeks, I tried out a different religion because I wanted to understand them. And I lived them. And I went to their churches, and and so over the period of my stay in Cambridge, as an undergraduate, I wanted to expose myself to religion and religious fervor and to be, but they didn't touch me. I mean, I was completely the same before and after. So I'm very embarrassed to tell you this. It's a confession that I really had hoped you wouldn't ask me to make. But my feeling is that I'm sort of like an automaton, an automaton, a kind of a robot. I'm just doing it because they wound me up and I'm just doing it. That's what it seems to me.
I think, Ashok, we can say that you've followed Gandhi's dictum to live the change you want to see. And to me, that's a very profound philosophy of life. We are at the top of the hour just about, but I'd love to ask you to close with what you'd like us all to remember from this extraordinary time with you. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, listen, I'm so grateful to all of you to have put up with my nonsense, and I'm glad to have been able to share with you some of the deeper concerns that any human being living today has. My own hope is that people like us, PLUs, are going to chip in together and support each other in every way in terms of moral and how would you say ethical support that we can give each other to encourage each other, to enable and facilitate each other's work by the kinds of simple rewards that are hard to come by, which is essentially the recognition that you can give people like you've done for me. I mean, I really appreciate that. And basically make it possible for us to share a few thoughts with others who may benefit from them and may actually react against them and do other things which will be just as good. I mean, that's also a future. But we've got to keep in mind that most of us have a future generation, whether they're our own kids and grandkids or they're our friends' grandkids, we're responsible for. And today, there's nothing more sacred than leaving behind an earth that's at least as good as we found it, if not better.
Ashok Khosla, founder of Development Alternatives and really one of the great thinkers and doers for a sustainable world. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joan.
Thank you,
Michael.
I just want to say, let's do what we can to find ways to support Ashok's work and to bring back not just a trickle, but a stream and a river of support for the extraordinary contribution that Ashok makes. Let's just hold that vision to support his work.